All right, we've just been looking at some difficult questions for the harm principle. What is harm? Can anything be counted as a harm? How close a connection does the conduct need to have to the harm in order to satisfy the harm principle? For those reasons, you might wonder whether the harm principle is actually really a useful limit on criminalization at the end of the day. So now I want to try to answer that question in this video. And what I'm going to say, this is my opinion, this is what I think. Happy to debate it, but fair point, this is still an open discussion. But here's what I think. So, right, the answer to this worry about whether the harm principle is useful is to remember how legislating works in practice. The legislature, right, it consists of a bunch of people with different views, and they're usually, like all of us, somewhat uncertain about basic moral principles, or at least how those principles apply to specific social problems, like what solutions are best. That means that for a criminal law to attract the majority support in the legislature, assuming the legislators are doing their job in good faith and they're not just unthinkingly voting as their political masters tell them to do, right? What that means is that the new criminal law being proposed is normally going to need not just a weak basis that makes it barely justified, like slightly more that counts in favor of it than against, but it's going to require a strong justification. A justification that can convince a lot of the multitude of representatives in the legislature with all their differing values and political commitments who face uncertainty about exactly what basic moral principles require in specific cases. So in that kind of practical context, the harm principle, I think, actually is a useful limit on criminalization. And the reason is that it puts pressure on the legislature to either show that the conduct to be criminalized is seriously harmful and therefore obviously satisfies the harm principle, or else come up with another clear and convincing basis for the law that they're proposing, which could render the law strongly justified, not just weakly supported. So think about it this way. If it's highly debatable whether a proposed new criminal law satisfies the harm principle, then practically speaking, we don't have a strong case for thinking that the new criminal law is legitimate and permissible to enact. But on the other hand, if it's debatable whether the harm principle is satisfied, we also don't have a very powerful objection to it, right? We don't have a powerful reason not to pass the crime, not to pass the law creating the crime of a kind that would convince lots of people. So if there's no strong objection to the law based on the harm principle, because it's kind of debatable whether the harm principle is satisfied, but if there is another alternative justification, like, for example, maybe the conduct to be criminalized is a serious moral wrong, even in the absence of harm, like lying or cheating, then the law would begin again to look like it has a strong enough justification to command the support of lots of people again. So I think this shows us how the harm principle actually does have some teeth in practice. At the end of the day, the harm principle, it basically comes down to this. To justify criminalizing some conduct X, either the legislature has to show that X is uncontroversially harmful in a tangible way that clearly satisfies the harm principle, or else it has to come up with a powerful alternative justification for criminalizing X that's uncontroversial. For example, that to the vast majority of people, even if it's not very harmful conduct, nonetheless, it's very morally culpable. Okay? So the kind of strong justification that a criminal law needs to have in order to be safely passed, we need arguments for it that provide a high level of confidence that the new proposed crime is indeed justified. So if the harm principle isn't clearly and uncontroversially satisfied, that makes it less likely that we have the kind of high confidence that is needed for the new crime to be clearly justified. And that'll put pressure on the legislature who wants to pass the law to either come up with a convincing alternative basis, like serious moral culpability, or else to just withdraw the law proposing to create the new crime. There are basically two main options here. Either the harm principle is clearly satisfied and prevents no bar to passing the law creating the new crime because the conduct is harmful, right? And uncontroversially so in a way that convinces lots of people. That's scenario one. Or, right, the alternative is the harm principle is not obviously satisfied because it's at best harmful in a way that's only very debatable and controversial. And in that case, which is what supporters of very expansive criminal laws and authoritarian governments, for example, are going to try to argue, In that case, where it's debatable, a borderline case, well, then there's no strong objection to the law from the harm principle, perhaps, but there's also no strong harm-based rationale for the new law that would command widespread support. So in those borderline or debatable cases, the harm principle puts pressure on the legislature to either find an alternative basis for the proposed new law, like that it is seriously and uncontroversially morally wrong, or get rid of the new law, get rid of the proposed crime. Okay, so the harm principle puts pressure on the criminal law. It puts pressure on the legislature to justify the laws that it wants to pass or withdraw the law. And admittedly, like that's not the strongest possible limit. It's not a perfect guarantee. It's not entirely immune from being gamed, and it's not entirely going to prevent any unjust, unfair, undue restriction of freedom. But it's not nothing either, and that's my point. For supporters of a liberal criminal law in a free society, it's at least one substantial tool in their toolbox, that the harm principle, which we should use to push back against expansive uses of the criminal law. Demonstrate clear and convincing harm of the conduct to be criminalized, or come up with a clear and convincing alternative basis besides harm that can command widespread support in favor of the law. Good luck.